The woman with the tangled chestnut hair had been sleeping in the barn for 3 weeks before anyone thought to ask her name. And even then, it was only because the foreman needed to know what to carve on a marker if she died from the fever that had taken hold of her thin frame. Zelda Vaughn had arrived in Abilene, Texas in the scorching summer of 1878, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a wedding ring that belonged to a dead man. Her husband had made it as far as Fort Worth before the cholera took him, leaving her stranded in a world that had no use for widows without family or fortune. She had walked the remaining miles to Abilene because someone told her the ranches were hiring, that anyone willing to work could find a place. They had not mentioned that a woman alone was worth less than livestock, or that the Harding Ranch where she finally collapsed would treat her accordingly. The ranch hands stepped over her when she slept in the doorway of the barn. They complained when she used the water pump, saying she was wasting resources that belonged to the horses. Martha Harding, the ranch owner's wife, had looked at Zelda exactly once with eyes like chips of granite and said she could stay only if she made herself useful. But there would be no pay, only scraps from the kitchen if there were any left after the men had eaten. Zelda had nodded because she had nowhere else to go, and at least the barn was shelter. She mucked stalls until her hands bled. She hauled water in buckets that seemed to grow heavier with each step. She mended tack with fingers that trembled from exhaustion and hunger. The ranch hands ignored her except to shove past her or bark orders. The cook gave her potato peels and hard bread that even the dogs would not touch. At night, she curled up in the corner of the barn, shivering despite the heat, listening to the horses breathe and wishing she could be one of them because at least they were fed properly, and their shelter was maintained with care. The fever started on a Tuesday. Zelda woke with her skin burning and her vision swimming, but she dragged herself to the stalls anyway, because missing work meant being turned out, and being turned out meant dying somewhere between Abilene and nowhere. She made it through 2 stalls before her legs gave out, and she crumpled into the hay. That was where James Alcott found her. James had been riding the circuit between ranches for the better part of 5 years, breaking horses and doing the kind of work that required a gentle hand and endless patience. He was 26 years old with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that fell across his forehead when he forgot to trim it. His eyes were the color of creek water in summer, clear and steady, and his hands were scarred from rope burns and horse bites, but surprisingly careful when they needed to be. He had a reputation for being quiet, for keeping to himself, for treating animals better than most men treated their own kin. He had arrived at the Harding Ranch that morning to assess a string of wild mustangs that needed breaking. The foreman had shown him to the barn and left him to his work, and James had been walking the stalls when he heard the shallow, rattling breathing coming from the corner. At first he thought it was an injured animal. Then he saw the woman. She was lying in the soiled hay, her dress torn and filthy, her face flushed with fever. Her lips were cracked and her breathing labored. James knelt beside her immediately, his hand going to her forehead. She was burning up. "Can you hear me?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Her eyelids fluttered but did not open. A small sound escaped her throat, something between a whimper and a sigh. James stood and strode out of the barn, his jaw set. He found the foreman near the corral and demanded to know who the woman was and why she was lying sick in the barn. The foreman shrugged and said she was nobody, just some widow who had wandered in looking for work. She was not worth the trouble. "She is dying," James said flatly. "Then I reckon she will die," the foreman replied. "We have got horses to tend to." James turned without another word and went back to the barn. He scooped Zelda up as easily as if she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest. She stirred slightly, her head lolling against his shoulder. He carried her out into the bright sunlight and across the yard to the bunkhouse where the ranch hands stayed. They stared at him as he shouldered through the door and laid her on his own bed, the only one that was empty during the day. "What the hell are you doing?" one of the men demanded. "Getting her out of that barn," James said. He filled a basin with water from the pitcher on the washstand and found a clean cloth. He sat on the edge of the bed and began to gently wipe the grime and sweat from Zelda's face. "She is not our problem," another man said. "She is now," James replied without looking up. The men grumbled but did not stop him. James worked methodically, cleaning her face and arms, dripping water onto her cracked lips. He found a blanket and covered her even though the room was warm, knowing that fevers sometimes brought chills. Then he sat beside the bed and waited. Zelda drifted in and out of consciousness for 2 days. Sometimes she muttered words that made no sense, names of people James did not know, fragments of prayers. He brought her water and broth from the kitchen, ignoring the cook's protests. He bathed her forehead when the fever spiked and kept the blanket tucked around her when she shivered. He did not leave except to tend to the most urgent tasks, and even then he hurried back. On the 3rd day, her eyes opened and focused on him. "Where am I?" Her voice was a rasp, barely audible. "The bunkhouse at the Harding Ranch," James said. "You have been sick." She tried to sit up, but he placed a hand on her shoulder, keeping her down. "Easy, you are still weak." "I need to work," she said, panic creeping into her voice. "They will turn me out if I do not work." "You are not going anywhere until you are well," James said firmly, tears welled in her eyes. "You do not understand. I have nowhere to go. I have nothing." "Then rest," James said, "and when you are strong enough, we will figure it out." She stared at him as if he had spoken a foreign language. Kindness was something she had not encountered in so long that she no longer knew how to recognize it. Slowly, she lay back down, her eyes never leaving his face. "What is your name?" he asked. "Zelda Vaughn." "I am James Alcott." He dipped the cloth in the water again and wiped her forehead. "You are safe here, Zelda." She did not believe him, but she was too tired to argue. Over the next week, Zelda regained her strength slowly. James brought her food, real food, not scraps. He made sure she had clean water and a place to rest. The other ranch hands mostly ignored her, but they did not bother her either, perhaps because they sensed that crossing James would not go well for them. Martha Harding came to the bunkhouse once, her mouth pinched in disapproval, but James met her at the door and spoke to her in low tones that Zelda could not hear. Whatever he said, Martha left without entering, though her expression was stormy. When Zelda was finally able to stand without swaying, James took her outside. The sunlight was blinding after days in the dim bunkhouse, and she squinted against it. He led her to a bench near the horse corral, and they sat together in silence for a while, watching the horses mill about. "Why did you help me?" Zelda asked eventually. James considered the question. "Because you needed help. No one else thought so." Then no one else was paying attention. He glanced at her. "What brought you to Abilene?" She told him, haltingly at first and then in a rush, about her husband and the cholera, about the long walk and the desperate hope that she could find work. She told him about the Hardings and how they had treated her, about sleeping in the barn and eating scraps. Her voice shook with the telling, but she did not cry. She had no tears left. James listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You deserve better than that," he said finally. "The world does not care what I deserve." "Maybe not," James said, "but I do." She looked at him, searching his face for some sign that he was mocking her, but there was only sincerity in his eyes. Something in her chest twisted, a painful hope that she was afraid to name. "I need to find work," she said. "Real work, not just charity." "You can help me with the horses," James said. "If you want. I could use an extra pair of hands and you would be paid. I do not know anything about breaking horses. I will teach you." Zelda hesitated. The offer seemed too good, too easy, but what choice did she have? "All right," she said. They started the next morning. James showed her how to approach the wild mustangs without spooking them, how to read their body language, how to move slowly and calmly so that the horses learned to trust rather than fear. He was patient with her in a way that no one had been patient in a very long time. When she made mistakes, he corrected her gently. When she succeeded, he praised her quietly. The horses responded to him in a way that seemed almost magical, and Zelda began to understand that what he did was not about dominance but about communication. She learned quickly. There was something soothing about the work, about the rhythm of it, the quiet conversations with animals who did not judge her. James worked beside her every day, and slowly, carefully, they began to talk about more than just horses. He told her about his childhood in Missouri, about losing his parents to a fire when he was 16, about the years he had spent drifting before finding his calling with horses. She told him about her life before her husband, about growing up in Georgia, about the dreams she had once had that seemed foolish now. The days turned into weeks. Zelda grew stronger, her hands toughening with the work, her body filling out as she ate properly for the first time in months. The other ranch hands began to nod to her in passing, acknowledging her presence. Even Martha Harding stopped glaring, though she was never friendly. What changed between Zelda and James was subtle at first, so gradual that neither of them noticed it happening. It was in the way he looked at her when he thought she was not watching, the softness in his eyes that had not been there before. It was in the way she found herself smiling when he was near, the way her heart beat a little faster when their hands accidentally touched. It was in the conversations that stretched long into the evening, sitting on the corral fence as the sun set, and the sky turned gold and orange and purple. One evening in late September, after they had finished working with a particularly stubborn mare, James and Zelda sat on the fence watching the stars emerge. The air had finally begun to cool, the oppressive heat of summer giving way to the promise of autumn. "I have been thinking," James said. "About what?" "About moving on. I have done what I came here to do. The horses are broken or close enough. It will be time to find another job soon." Something cold settled in Zelda's stomach. "Oh, I was wondering if you might want to come with me." She turned to look at him, startled. His face was serious in the dim light. "Come with you," she echoed. "I know a ranch up near Fort Worth. The owner is a good man, fair. He is always looking for people who know horses. I could get us both hired on." He hesitated. "Unless you want to stay here." "No," Zelda said quickly. "I do not want to stay here." "Then come with me." It was not a declaration of love, not yet, but it was something, an acknowledgement that what had grown between them was real enough to take a chance on. Zelda felt the hope she had been afraid to name bloom in her chest. "Yes," she said. "I will come with you." James smiled, and it transformed his whole face. "Good." They left the Harding Ranch a week later. James collected his pay, and to Zelda's surprise, he insisted that the foreman pay her as well for the work she had done with the horses. The foreman grumbled but handed over a small pouch of coins. It was not much, but it was the first money Zelda had earned in her own right, and she clutched it tightly as they rode away from the ranch on horses that James had purchased with his savings. The journey to Fort Worth took 4 days. They traveled slowly, camping under the stars at night. James taught Zelda how to build a fire properly and how to cook over it. They talked about everything and nothing, their words weaving a tapestry of shared experience. On the 3rd night, as they sat by the fire, James reached out and took her hand. She did not pull away. "I want you to know something," he said. What I feel for you, it is not charity. It is not because I felt sorry for you. What is it then? Zelda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It is because when I look at you, I see someone who is strong and brave and kind despite everything that has tried to break her. I see someone I want to know for the rest of my life. He paused. I see someone I am falling in love with. Tears spilled down Zelda's cheeks, but they were not tears of sadness. I am falling in love with you too, she said. James leaned forward and kissed her, gentle and sweet, and Zelda felt as if something inside her that had been frozen was finally beginning to thaw. They arrived at the ranch near Fort Worth on a bright October morning. The owner, a weathered man named Thomas Crawford, greeted James warmly and listened as James explained that he and Zelda were looking for work. Thomas looked Zelda over, not unkindly, and asked if she knew horses. She is one of the best I have worked with, James said before Zelda could answer. Thomas nodded. All right then. You are both hired. There is a cabin out past the main barn that needs some fixing up, but you can stay there if you are willing to do the work. James glanced at Zelda and she nodded. We will take it, James said. The cabin was small and in disrepair, but it was theirs. They spent the next 2 weeks cleaning and mending, patching the roof and scrubbing the floors, fixing the door and replacing the broken window. Thomas provided them with basic furniture, a bed and a table and chairs, and Zelda used her small savings to buy fabric to make curtains. It was simple, but it felt like a palace compared to the barn at the Harding Ranch. They fell into a routine. James worked with the horses and Zelda worked alongside him. In the evenings, they returned to the cabin and cooked dinner together, their movements around the small space becoming synchronized. They talked and laughed, and sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence. On Sundays, they rode out to explore the land, discovering a creek where the water ran clear and cold, a meadow full of wildflowers that Zelda loved. In November, James asked her to marry him. They were sitting by the creek, the autumn leaves drifting down around them. James turned to her and took both her hands in his. Zelda Vaughn, you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known, he said. I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Will you marry me? Zelda's heart felt too big for her chest. Yes, she said. Yes, 1,000 times yes. They were married in Fort Worth a week later, in a small church with Thomas Crawford and his wife as witnesses. Zelda wore a simple dress that Thomas's wife had helped her sew, and James wore his best clothes. The ceremony was short, but when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and James kissed her, Zelda felt as if she were floating. Their life together was not easy. The work was hard, the hours long, but it was good. James treated her with a respect and tenderness that still surprised her sometimes, as if she could not quite believe it was real. He asked her opinion on the horses, listened to her ideas, praised her successes. He made her feel valued, not just as a wife but as a partner. And Zelda loved him with a fierceness that sometimes scared her, this man who had seen her at her lowest and decided she was worth everything. Winter came, cold and harsh. They spent the long evenings in the cabin, huddled by the fire. James carved small wooden animals, a hobby he had picked up as a boy, and Zelda sewed quilts from scraps of fabric. They played cards and read aloud from the few books they owned. On the coldest nights, they lay tangled together in bed, sharing warmth and whispered words of love. In the spring, Zelda realized she was pregnant. She told James one morning in April as they were preparing to go out to the corrals. He stared at her for a moment, his expression unreadable, and then he let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around. She laughed, dizzy and happy, and when he set her down, he kissed her with such tenderness that she thought her heart might burst. "We are going to have a baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "We are going to have a baby," she repeated. James became even more protective after that, insisting that she not overwork herself, that she rest when she was tired. Zelda protested that she was pregnant, not fragile, but she secretly loved the way he fussed over her. Thomas was understanding, giving her lighter tasks as her belly grew. The other ranch hands congratulated them, and Thomas's wife brought over baby clothes that her own children had outgrown. The baby came in December, a week before Christmas. It was a long, difficult labor, and there were moments when James was terrified that he would lose her. But Zelda was strong, and when the midwife finally placed the squalling, red-faced infant in her arms, James wept with relief. "It is a boy," the midwife said. They named him Jacob, after James's father. He had dark hair like James and a loud, healthy cry. James held him with such care, as if he were made of glass, and Zelda watched her husband cradle their son and felt a love so overwhelming that it brought tears to her eyes. Life changed with the baby. The cabin that had seemed cozy now felt cramped, but they made it work. Zelda learned how to balance caring for Jacob with helping James with the horses. It was exhausting, but it was also joyful in a way she had never imagined. Watching James with their son, seeing the gentleness in his hands as he changed diapers and soothed cries, made her fall even more deeply in love with him. Jacob grew quickly, a happy baby who laughed easily and rarely fussed. When he was 6 months old, Thomas offered James a partnership in the ranch. It was a generous offer, one that would give them financial security and a future. James discussed it with Zelda, and they agreed to accept. Over the next few years, the ranch prospered. James's reputation as a horseman grew, and people came from miles around seeking his expertise. Zelda managed the business side, keeping the books and handling correspondence. They hired additional hands and expanded the corrals. The cabin was replaced with a proper house, not large but comfortable, with enough room for their growing family. In 1881, Zelda gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Josephine. She had Zelda's chestnut hair and James's steady eyes. Jacob, now 3, was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to hold her and help care for her. 2 years later, another son arrived, Samuel, who was quieter than his siblings but just as loved. The years passed in a blur of work and family, hardships and triumphs. There were droughts that tested them, illnesses that scared them, accidents that reminded them how fragile life could be. But there were also moments of pure happiness, watching their children grow, celebrating small victories, sitting together on the porch in the evenings as the sun set and the land turned gold. James never stopped treating Zelda as if she were everything. He consulted her on every major decision, valued her opinion, supported her dreams. When she wanted to start breeding horses herself, focusing on temperament and intelligence rather than just speed or strength, he encouraged her. When her horses began to gain a reputation of their own, he was the first to celebrate her success. Zelda never forgot where she had come from, the woman who had slept in the barn and been treated as less than the animals. It made her grateful for what she had, yes, but it also made her determined to help others. She made sure that any hands they hired were treated fairly, paid well, given decent housing. When a young woman showed up at the ranch one day, desperate and hungry, Zelda took her in without hesitation, gave her work and dignity. James watched his wife with pride, loving her even more for her compassion. In 1887, when Jacob was 9, Josephine 6, and Samuel 4, Thomas Crawford passed away peacefully in his sleep. His children had no interest in ranching, and they offered to sell James and Zelda the entire property. It took every bit of their savings and a loan from the bank, but they managed it. The ranch that had given them a new start was now fully theirs. They renamed it the Alcott Ranch and continued to build on the foundation they had created. Jacob showed an early aptitude for working with horses, just like his father. Josephine was more interested in the business side, often sitting with her mother as Zelda worked on the accounts. Samuel loved the land itself, always exploring, bringing home interesting rocks and feathers and asking endless questions about the world. The years continued to roll by, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. The children grew into young adults. Jacob became his father's right hand, taking over much of the day-to-day horse training. Josephine went to school in Fort Worth and came back with ideas for expanding their business, breeding programs and sales strategies that proved remarkably successful. Samuel, after much soul-searching, decided to become a veterinarian, heading east to study and then returning to practice in the area. Through it all, James and Zelda remained devoted to each other. Their love, which had begun in a barn where she had been left to die, had grown and deepened over the years. They knew each other's thoughts, finished each other's sentences, could communicate with a glance. They still sat together on the porch in the evenings, his arm around her shoulders, her head on his chest, watching the sunset and talking about their day. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1899, James gave Zelda a locket. Inside were tiny photographs of their 3 children. "I want you to have this," he said, "so you never forget what we built together." "I could never forget," Zelda said, tears in her eyes. "You saved my life, James." "No," he said, kissing her forehead. "You saved mine. Before you, I was just existing, going through the motions. You gave me purpose. You gave me love. You gave me a family and a home and a reason to wake up every morning grateful to be alive." "We saved each other then," Zelda said. "Yes," James agreed. "We did." In 1902, Jacob married a sweet-natured schoolteacher named Anna, and they built a house on the edge of the ranch property. A year later, they made James and Zelda grandparents with the birth of a daughter. Holding that tiny baby, seeing her son as a father, Zelda was overwhelmed with emotion. She thought about the woman she had been 24 years earlier, starving and sick in a barn, believing she had no future. If that woman could see her now, surrounded by family and love, what would she think? Josephine married in 1904, a young banker from Fort Worth who was intelligent and kind and utterly smitten with her. They stayed in town, where Josephine opened an office to manage the business interests of several ranches in the area, including the Alcott Ranch. Samuel remained unmarried, dedicated to his practice, but he was a frequent visitor and a beloved uncle to the growing brood of grandchildren. James and Zelda grew older together, their hair turning gray, their movements a bit slower. But the love between them never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger, tempered by decades of partnership and devotion. They still worked together, though they left more of the heavy labor to the younger generation. They still sat on the porch together every evening. They still reached for each other in the night, finding comfort and passion in the familiar touch of the other. One evening in the spring of 1910, as they sat watching yet another spectacular Texas sunset, Zelda turned to James. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "Regret what?" "Helping me. Taking a chance on a woman you did not know, everything that came after." James looked at her, his creek-water eyes still clear despite his 58 years. "Zelda Alcott, loving you is the best thing I have ever done. I have never regretted a single moment, even the hard times." "Especially the hard times," he said, "because we faced them together and we came through stronger." Zelda smiled and leaned into him. "I love you, James Alcott, more than words can say." "I love you too," he said, kissing the top of her head. "Always have, always will." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the day fade into night. Around them, the ranch hummed with life. They could hear the sounds of horses in the corrals, the distant laughter of grandchildren playing, the creak of the windmill turning. This was their legacy, built on love and hard work, and the determination to treat each other with dignity and respect. In 1915, they celebrated their 36th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children, their grandchildren, and the community they had built. The party was held at the ranch, with tables groaning under the weight of food, music playing, people dancing. James and Zelda stood together watching it all, their hands intertwined. "Did you ever imagine this?" James asked. "Back when we first met?" "No," Zelda said honestly. "I could not have imagined anything this wonderful." "Neither could I," James said, "but I am so grateful it happened." As the evening wore on and the stars came out, James led Zelda onto the makeshift dance floor. They swayed together to a slow waltz, her head on his chest, his arms around her. The years had been kind to them, and even the hardships had been bearable because they had faced them together. Their story was not one of grand adventures or dramatic rescues, though it had started with one. It was a story of two people who had found each other when they both needed someone, who had chosen each other every day since. It was a story of love that grew slowly and steadily, rooted in respect and trust and genuine affection. It was a story of building a life together, brick by brick, moment by moment, until they had created something beautiful and lasting. The years continued. There were more grandchildren and then great-grandchildren. There were losses, too, as is inevitable with time. Friends passed. Thomas's widow died. There were accidents and illnesses. But through it all, James and Zelda remained each other's constant, each other's anchor. In the summer of 1922, at the age of 70, James fell ill. It was nothing dramatic, just a slow decline that doctors could not explain or halt. Zelda nursed him with the same care he had once shown her, never leaving his side. Their children took over the running of the ranch, allowing their parents this time together. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, James took Zelda's hand. "I am not afraid," he said, his voice weak but steady. "I know," Zelda said, tears streaming down her face. "You have never been afraid of anything." "Because I have had you beside me," he said. "You made me brave." "No," Zelda said. "You were always brave. You just needed someone to see it." James smiled. "I want you to know that my life has been everything I could have hoped for, more than I deserved." "You deserved every happiness," Zelda said fiercely. "You deserved the world, James Alcott." "I got it," he said, "because I got you." He died peacefully that night with Zelda holding his hand, their children gathered around. The grief was overwhelming, a physical pain that Zelda thought might kill her too. But she was strong, had always been strong, and she carried on because that was what James would have wanted. The years after James's death were difficult for Zelda, but she was not alone. Her children rallied around her, as did her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The ranch continued to thrive under Jacob's management, with input from Josephine and visits from Samuel when his practice allowed. Zelda spent her days helping where she could, telling stories about James to the younger generations who had never known him, keeping his memory alive. She lived for another 8 years, watching the ranch grow and change, watching her family expand. She saw the world change too, the old ways of the West fading into history, replaced by automobiles and electricity and all manner of modern conveniences. But some things remained the same: the importance of family, the value of hard work, the power of love. On a warm spring evening in 1930, Zelda passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 76. She was buried beside James on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a spreading oak tree. Their headstone was simple, bearing their names and dates, and below that, an inscription that Jacob had chosen: "Together always." The legacy they left behind was not just the ranch, though it continued to prosper for generations. It was not just their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, though they numbered in the dozens and spread across Texas and beyond. It was the story of two people who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances and built something beautiful together. It was the story of love that endured, that transformed lives, that proved that one person treating another with dignity and respect could change everything. Years later, when Jacob was an old man himself, he would tell his grandchildren about their great-grandparents. He would tell them about Zelda, who had arrived at the Harding Ranch with nothing and been treated as less than the horses. He would tell them about James, the quiet cowboy who had seen her worth when no one else did, who had treated her like she was everything. He would tell them how that love had grown into something that shaped not just two lives but many, creating a family and a legacy that endured. And the children would listen, wide-eyed, understanding even at their young age that they were hearing something important. They would learn that love was not just about grand gestures or dramatic moments, though those had their place. Love was about seeing someone, truly seeing them and choosing them. It was about building something together, day by day, through good times and bad. It was about treating each other with kindness and respect, about being partners in the truest sense of the word. The Alcott Ranch stood for another century, eventually being donated to the state as a historical site. Visitors came from all over to see the preserved buildings, to learn about life in the Old West, to hear the stories of the people who had lived there. And always, the story that captured hearts was that of James and Zelda Alcott, the cowboy and the woman who had been treated as less than nothing, who had found each other and built a love that lasted a lifetime. In the small museum on the property, there was a display case with artifacts from their lives. The locket James had given Zelda on their 20th anniversary, a pair of James's spurs, one of Zelda's quilts, the deed to the ranch bearing both their names. And beside these items was their story, written out in careful script, preserved for future generations. Because some stories deserve to be remembered. Some loves deserve to be celebrated. And the story of James and Zelda Alcott, which began in a barn in Abilene, Texas in 1878, was one of them. It was a story that proved that no matter how low you fall, no matter how worthless the world makes you feel, there can be someone who sees your value, someone who treats you not as less than, but as everything. And if you are lucky enough to find that person, if you are brave enough to accept their love and return it, you can build something that lasts not just a lifetime, but forever. The horses in the corrals at the historical site, descendants of the animals James and Zelda had worked with so many years ago, grazed peacefully in the Texas sun. The windmill still turned, creaking slightly, a sound that had been the soundtrack to two remarkable lives. The porch where they had sat together countless evenings remained, weathered but sturdy, a testament to the strength of what they had built. And if you stood very quietly on that porch at sunset, when the sky turned gold and orange and the air grew cool, you could almost feel them there. James with his arm around Zelda's shoulders, her head on his chest, both of them watching the day end and feeling grateful for every moment they had been given. Together, as they had been in life, as they would be forever. The end of their physical story, perhaps, but not the end of their legacy. That lived on in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their blood and their values. It lived on in the ranch that bore their name. It lived on in the hearts of everyone who heard their story and was inspired by it. Because James Alcott had seen a woman dying in a barn and recognized her worth. Because Zelda Vaughn had accepted his kindness and returned his love. Because they had chosen each other every day for 44 years. Because what they built together was stronger than hardship, deeper than passion, more enduring than stone. Their story was proof that love could heal, could transform, could create something beautiful out of nothing. It was proof that one person could make all the difference in another person's life. It was proof that treating someone with dignity and respect, seeing them as they truly are and loving them for it, was the most powerful force in the world. And so their story continued to be told, generation after generation. A tale of the Old West that was about more than cowboys and cattle and wide open spaces. It was about the courage to be kind, the strength to be vulnerable, the power of seeing someone and declaring, without words but through every action, that they matter, that they are everything. James and Zelda Alcott had lived and loved and built something remarkable. They had faced the world together and emerged victorious not through violence or conquest, but through partnership and devotion. They had proven that the greatest adventures are not always about taming wild horses or surviving harsh conditions, though they had done both. Sometimes the greatest adventure is simply loving someone with your whole heart and being loved in return. In the Alcott family, passed down from parent to child for generations, was a tradition. On wedding days, the family gathered and the eldest member would tell the story of James and Zelda. They would speak of the barn in Abilene, of the cowboy who refused to walk past a suffering woman, of the love that grew between two people who had nothing but each other. They would speak of the life that was built, the family that was raised, the legacy that endured. And then they would raise a glass and offer a toast, to love that sees worth where others see nothing, to partnerships built on respect and trust, to treating each other not as less than but as everything, to building something that lasts. It was a fitting tribute to two remarkable people who had taken their second chances and made the most of them, who had loved each other through poverty and prosperity, through sickness and health, through every challenge life threw at them, who had created not just a family or a ranch, but a testament to the transformative power of love. The Texas sun continued to rise and set over the land they had worked. The seasons continued to turn, as they always had and always would. But the story of James and Zelda Alcott remained constant, a beacon of hope and love for anyone who heard it. A reminder that no matter how dark things seem, there can be light. No matter how alone you feel, there can be connection. No matter how worthless the world makes you feel, there can be someone who sees your value and treats you accordingly. Their love story was complete, from that first moment in the barn to their final days together and beyond. It was a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, but also a story that continued in the lives they had touched and the legacy they had created. It was a story of the Old West, yes, but also a timeless story that transcended era and location. It was the story of two people who found each other when they both needed someone most, who chose each other again and again, who built a life together that was richer and fuller and more meaningful than either could have imagined, who proved that love, real love, the kind that endures and transforms, is the greatest adventure of all. And so the story ends where it began, in Abilene, Texas, in a barn where a woman was treated as less than the horses, where a cowboy named James Alcott looked at her and saw not waste or burden, but potential and worth, where he made a choice that changed two lives forever. That choice echoed through the decades, through the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried forward the values James and Zelda had lived by. It echoed in the ranch that bore their name, in the stories that were told about them, in the love that they had shared, and that continued to inspire. They had been two ordinary people living in an era of great change and challenge. But what they created together was extraordinary, a love story for the ages, a testament to the power of kindness and respect and genuine affection. A reminder that treating someone like they are everything can change not just their life, but the world itself. James and Zelda Alcott. The cowboy and the woman who had nothing. Two souls who found each other in the least likely of places and built something that lasted forever. Their story was complete, their legacy secure, their love eternal. And that, truly, was everything.